Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and today we're going to be talking about fantasy subgenres. Specifically like what they are, what they mean, why they matter, maybe why they don't matter, and just what the definitions of them are, because a lot of them are pretty contentious, which is really interesting to me. But people have very different opinions about this. What inspired this video was a combination of two videos that I saw pop up in my feed recently. One of them was by Pedrick Leo, and one of them was from Tori Talks with Joanna. And basically the premise of all of them was like, where has all the epic fantasy gone? Or why isn't epic fantasy trending anymore? So I watched both of those videos. They were both really interesting discussions and they touched on different things. So this just got me like really interested in like what the definitions of different subgenres are, because Tori and Joanna in their discussion were actually like trying to define what epic fantasy is. So this led me down a whole rabbit hole. I watched 3 other YouTubers' videos, similar premise to this, where they were also like trying to define different fantasy subgenres. So the ones that I watched were from Daniel Green, Captured in Words, and Bookborn. And all 3 of those videos had different definitions for the same subgenres in at least a couple of categories. I just thought this would be really fun to talk about. So let's just start off with like, first of all, what is genre, right? Genre is just a category of what to expect when you open a book. It's fantasy, it's sci-fi, it's romance, it's mystery, it's horror, it's literary, whatever. It helps connect readers to the books they want to read. Subgenre is the same sort of thing. It's trying to categorize books in order to connect them to the readers who want to read those sorts of books. Really, genre and subgenre both are just a marketing term. It's not like writers necessarily set out to say like, I'm going to write a historical portal fantasy. They just probably want to write like a cool story, and it happens to fall into those subgenres. Genre usually does a pretty good job of capturing what a book is like, but subgenre is really like a way of splitting hairs, and the more finesse you get into it, the less kind of meaning it has, and in almost all cases it is an oversimplification. Also, subgenres are born and die all the time. For instance, when I was watching some of these videos and like doing some research online with like different articles and stuff, a subgenre that came up once or twice was called Arthurian fantasy. Which, like, when was the last time you heard anyone talk about Arthurian fantasy on BookTube or any other place that you look at books? Like, that was a subgenre that had its heyday, and now it has pretty much like passed out of our knowledge. Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's like fantasy based on or inspired by King Arthur's court. That's obviously not trending these days. That doesn't mean it won't again, but for now, that subgenre, I think, is kind of dead. On the other hand, we have subgenres that feel pretty new to the fantasy world, like cozy fantasy and romantasy are both like having kind of a heyday right now. So I feel like I could make this video again in like 3 or 4 years and possibly have different ones that aren't on this video, and possibly some of the ones on this video won't be relevant anymore. And that's totally fine. You know, that's just the nature of trends and marketing and what's cool. Also, one of the things that Tori mentioned on her video, which I think is really interesting, is that indie publishing and like the rise of self-publishing has really started shifting and blurring these lines for subgenres in a lot of different ways, because indie authors aren't as constrained by the big 5 publishing companies on like, we need to market to these categories or we need to write and publish books that fit these trends. And so indie authors really have more flexibility to write what they want without trying to pigeonhole it into one of these things. And they're really like pushing and flexing a lot of the boundaries of what we understand fantasy to be. And I think that's really exciting. If you want to get really jargony, in addition to genre, you also have categories, which are usually like age ranges, right? You have adult fantasy, YA or young adult fantasy, middle grade fantasy, that kind of thing. A lot of people tend to say that YA is a genre, but that's not true. YA fantasy is a category and genre together. And then, you know, YA fantasy can be romantasy, it can be cozy fantasy, it can be grimdark fantasy, it can be all kinds of different things. So YA or young adult is not a genre, it's just an age category. And then the other thing that I think sometimes blurs the line with subgenres are tropes. Tropes are just like common storytelling devices that you see in a lot of different stories. So in fantasy, a really popular one is like the chosen one trope, or a magical academy trope. Or, you know, in romance, you have like enemies to lovers or grumpy sunshine and things like that. In some ways, I think the lines are becoming more and more blurred between what a trope is and what a subgenre is, because both of them give you some idea of what is in the story, and tropes seem like more and more commonly are being used to market books in recent years, especially because of the rise of TikTok and how people tend to talk about books in like really short snippets to give you an idea of what it's about. And so one of the things that I found interesting when I was watching other people's videos, I think specifically Daniel Green's video and Captured in Words video, was they had a subgenre of fantasy called court intrigue, or fantasy of manners. And to me, court intrigue seems like more of a trope than a subgenre, but I don't know, what do I know? Also, Daniel Green said that coming of age was a subgenre. And of course, you know, I'm sure he's not inventing this out of his mind, right? He's like getting it from other places where he's done research on subgenres. But to me, coming of age is more of a trope. But again, like, where do you draw the line between trope and subgenre sometimes, I think is getting more and more blurred. Those are just kind of my thoughts on like the difference between genre, subgenre, category, and trope. One additional caveat before we dive into the definitions of different fantasy subgenres, I'm just going to say that these definitions are just kind of like what I've gathered through osmosis of my research. But like I said, a lot of times the definitions were different depending on which article you clicked on or what YouTuber you were watching. And so sometimes I'm veering away from maybe the technical definition and going for more of the colloquial understanding of what these different subgenres are. And I believe that these sorts of things can also change over time. So again, in a few years, this video might be completely irrelevant. But with all that being said, let's talk about fantasy subgenres. So starting with high fantasy. And right away, we're going to have a little bit of a controversy here, because how I think I'm going to define high fantasy and how Tori Talks and Joanna talked about high fantasy is definitely a little bit different. I think they said that high fantasy is basically epic fantasy, but on the scale more of like the problems of a character or a group of characters. And I don't really agree with that definition. I agree more with what Daniel Green said about high fantasy, which is that high fantasy is any fantasy novel or movie or what have you, where the world is completely fantastical. It is not set on Earth. The entire culture, the entire ecosystem, all of that sort of stuff, the magic, the fantastical creatures are entirely new. Most of the like big names that you can think of are high fantasy, right? Like Lord of the Rings is like the classic high fantasy example. The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss, things like that. And then our next subgenre we have is epic fantasy. And Daniel Green says that epic fantasy and high fantasy are the same thing. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. Like I said, all these subgenres are completely just splitting hairs. But to me, epic fantasy is about the scope of the fantasy that is covered in the book. And so it deals with problems on the scale of humanity, of society, like big earth-shattering things, or potentially like the span of time that it covers is just like generations and generations of people, not necessarily about the scope of time, but just the scale of the fantasy is large. Epic fantasy and high fantasy, obviously, like any fantasy book is probably going to have multiple subgenres. So just because one fits one and doesn't mean it doesn't fit the other. But examples of epic fantasy would be like Malazan Book of the Fallen or the Stormlight Archive, things like that by Brandon Sanderson. I think a lot of people tend to think that epic fantasy means that it's like a really long book. And I don't think epic has anything to do with like the length of the story. It might cover a large length of time, but I think you could tell an epic fantasy story in a novella if you wanted to. Again, it's about the scope of what is covered within the pages, not the number of pages. Now, I have in the the past used epic fantasy and high fantasy to be the same term. And I think that's totally fine if you do. I think people generally have an idea of what you mean when you say epic or high fantasy, and there's so much overlap between those two subgenres that I think it's fine to use them interchangeably, even though I'm defining them a little bit differently here. Then let's talk about cozy fantasy. This is one of the new darlings in the marketing world right now that really, I think, kicked off or was brought broadly into the spotlight because of the book Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. And cozy fantasy is just defined by basically like a low stakes plot, kind of warm fuzzy feelings, and generally good characters. Good in terms of like good and evil, not in terms of like they're well written or anything. The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, I think, would be another example of that. Then there's historical fantasy, which is one that I really love. Historical fantasy is fantasy that's set in our world in a historical time and place that actually existed, but just with a twist of fantasy elements of some kind. So examples of this would be like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, or the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik. Then I saw in a few places alternate history fantasy was defined differently than just historical fantasy, and their definition for that is, you know, set on Earth in a historical place and time that we know, but the historical events unfold differently than they did in actual history because of plot fantasy things. To me, I don't split these hairs. To me, an alternate history fantasy and historical fantasy are just the same. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably because I think that's a pretty fine line to draw. Then there's urban fantasy. Urban fantasy, I think, often gets confused for paranormal fantasy, and those are not the same thing, but often people do say urban fantasy when they mean paranormal fantasy because paranormal is so often set in urban settings. But there are great examples of urban fantasy that are not paranormal. For instance, the Green Bones Saga by Fonda Lee or Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman are great urban fantasy novels. So then paranormal fantasy is just any fantasy that involves like vampires, werewolves, ghosts, zombies, that kind of thing. And often, again, those are urban fantasy stories, but they don't have to be. And then a subgenre of paranormal fantasy is like paranormal romance, which of course had its huge heyday back in the day because of Twilight. But there are tons of paranormal fantasies that are not paranormal romance, like The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher or Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. Then we have grimdark fantasy, which is different from dark fantasy. Grimdark fantasy is defined, in my mind, by basically like morally gray characters. It's not necessarily good versus evil. It's not even often clear if there is pure good or pure evil at work. And if there is, then in grimdark, good often doesn't win. So obvious examples of this one are, of course, A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones series by George R.R. Martin, or The First Law World by Joe Abercrombie. Then dark fantasy is not the same as grimdark. Dark fantasy is fantasy that includes some horror elements, or like kind of a horror fantasy blend genre. And so examples of this would be like Coraline by Neil Gaiman, or the Gunslinger series, the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. Then keeping on our dark theme, we also have dark academia fantasy. Dark academia is a genre or subgenre that definitely doesn't have to be fantasy. There's dark academia books that are, you know, set in the real world, have no fantastical elements, but there is also a fantasy dark academia category, which includes things like Babel by R.F. Kuang and A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, or Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. These are all books that deal with academic settings, but in a dark way. And they often involve like secret societies, murder, you know, they're more used as like a commentary on academia for the most part. Then another new darling in the fantasy marketing world is Romantasy, or fantasy romance, and that is pretty self-explanatory. It is set in a fantasy world, but it's mostly a romance plot. This has become so popular recently that I think a lot of new fantasy books that are being published that do have a romantic subplot are often being called Romantasy when they're not actually Romantasy, because they are fantasy forward with a romance in the back seat. But because I think Romantasy is having a heyday right now, I think the publishing companies are really trying to grab those Romantasy readers and directing them towards books that aren't exactly Romantasy. So that's definitely an issue, but again, these things are so split hairsy, it's like, where do you draw the line? I talk about that a little bit more in my video about all the Goodreads Choice Awards drama from last year in November. Then there's heroic fantasy, and heroic fantasy is just about a hero going on an epic quest. It's usually like one central main character, and it's generally about like good versus evil. So examples of this would be like Aragon by Christopher Paolini or The Hobbit by George R.R. Tolkien. Wow. J.R.R. Tolkien, not George R.R. Martin. And then kind of a subgenre of heroic fantasy is sword and sorcery, or sometimes just called adventure fantasy. But sword and sorcery is basically heroic fantasy, but it's considered a bit more pulpy, and instead of maybe being like on a huge epic scale, it's more about like the action and the combat and the like small encounters. So things like The Witcher and Conan the Barbarian are great examples of that. Then we have low fantasy, and low fantasy was one of the ones that I feel like almost every definition that I clicked on was a little bit different. And so I basically came up with, I think, 3 different definitions of what people think low fantasy is, which was intriguing. Low fantasy, at least the definition that I am clinging to, is set in our normal world, and whatever fantastical or magical elements are brought into it are a surprise to the people who encounter it. They don't expect there to be fantasy in our real world, right? So examples of this would be like Indian in the Cupboard, where the little boy's like toy comes to life, or The Green Mile by Stephen King, where the prisoner like has unexplained healing powers, right? So that would be low fantasy. Other people, for instance, Bookborn on YouTube, said that low fantasy just means that like basically high fantasy, but there's just like low emphasis on magic or fantastical creatures. And she gave the example of like the First Law world, which doesn't have like a ton of that kind of stuff in it. It's more about like battle and political intrigue and stuff like that. But to me, that is so amorphous to like put your finger on. It's like, there's no real way to draw the line and be like, well, this doesn't have enough fantasy elements in it, so it's low fantasy. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I like the definition of low fantasy that I saw in other places, which again was set in our world, but the fantasy elements are surprising. And so I actually saw the example of this given as like the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling, because it's our real world, right? But when you find out that there is magic, obviously Harry was very surprised. To me, that's like if you go by Bookborn's definition, that definitely is like way too magical to be considered low fantasy. So again, choose the definition that works for you. I guess if people are talking about low fantasy in the places that you're looking at books, just try and understand from context clues which one they're trying to mean. So then kind of the sister definition to low fantasy is magical realism, or at least again, the definition that I gave. Magical realism is like low fantasy in that it's set in our real world, and there are some magical or fantastical elements, but those are not surprising to the characters. Those are accepted as a part of the real world. And so examples of this would be like When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill, which I just read recently, where it's our world, but there are dragons. Or the most famous classic example is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Then there's 3 different subgenres of fantasy that specifically have to do with historical settings and the time periods that they take place in. And so they're almost like a subgenre of historical, but different. So the obvious one, of course, is steampunk fantasy. Steampunk is set in basically the Industrial Revolution era, where there's lots of steam-powered technology, but that technology is taken to places that steam power never actually took us in the real world. And so there's a lot of emphasis on like the aesthetic of gear-driven technology, and often like airships and things are a big part of the culture in steampunk. So examples of that would be like A Master of Djinn by P. Djeli Clark, or Sinlin of Sins by Josiah Bancroft. Then there's gunpowder fantasy, which I've also heard called Flintlock fantasy. And this is just fantasy where gunpowder exists, because so much fantasy takes place kind of in a more medieval setting. So gunpowder fantasy is just fantasy with guns. Some people like tried to split hairs and be like, well, if if it's steampunk and they have guns, then it's not gunpowder fantasy, it's steampunk fantasy. And then other people were just like, if it has guns in it, it counts, it's gunpowder or flintlock fantasy. Again, it doesn't really matter to me that much, but the most prominent example of gunpowder fantasy is The Powder Mage by Brian McClellan, and like Mistborn era 2, I think could be kind of both steampunk and gunpowder fantasy, and also kind of Western. I didn't see a subcategory for Western fantasy, but I'm sure that is a thing. And then the final historical time period subgenre of fantasy is called Gaslamp Fantasy, which honestly is not even a term I was familiar with, but this just means it's like Victorian era or Edwardian era. And so it kind of has that more like Pride and Prejudice-esque feeling. And again, I think this pairs well with the subgenre that I don't really think is a subgenre earlier, where it's like heavy on the court intrigue or the politics of manners and that sort of thing. So examples of that would be like Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater or The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wicker. Then there's Portal Fantasy. Portal Fantasy is so much of the fantasy world that I almost don't even know, like, is it its own subgenre or is it just like a really common trope? Again, where do we draw the line here? But portal fantasies are things like the Chronicles of Narnia or the Wayward Children series by Shauna McGuire or Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, those sorts of things. Anywhere where there is kind of a normal world, whether it's our world or not, but you have to go through a portal or a magical doorway or what have you to get to the magical world. There's also comic fantasy, also sometimes called absurdist fantasy, and this is fantasy for the laughs. That it's not necessarily shallow, it can cover like really deep things, but the entertainment factor of it comes from the comedy aspect. And so Discworld from Terry Pratchett is obviously the huge example of this. He set the standard for absurdist fantasy, and then things like Good Omens and The Princess Bride. I haven't read the book, but definitely the movie The Princess Bride would be a comic fantasy for sure. Then you have fables or fairy tale fantasy. This is a subgenre that relies on like plots, characters, settings, or themes that you already understand and know from folklore, but just taken in a new direction or with some sort of twist. To me, any sort of like mythological retelling would also fall into the fantasy fable subgenre, although sometimes I think mythological retellings have become so popular that that could almost be its own subgenre. But examples of this would be like Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik or Circe by Madeline Miller. Then there is Sci-Fantasy or science fantasy, and this one I think is almost, it's interesting how people feel about sci-fantasy because it is literally just a blending of sci-fi elements and fantasy. And to me, when I read a sci-fantasy book, I sometimes, if they're heavier on the sci-fi elements with some fantastical elements, then I tend to think of them as sci-fi. And if they're fantastical with some elements of sci-fi, then I tend to think of them as more fantasy. But sci-fantasy is its own thing, and I love that that is a growing genre. I think both of these speculative genres have a lot to draw from on each other and can make some really interesting and unique stories in that way. Examples of this would be like Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence or the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. Dune, even by Frank Herbert, is like most people consider sci-fi, but definitely has like some magic in it. So it's all over the place, and I love that for it. Then we have several categories that I really don't know too much about because I don't really read in them. Christian fantasy is definitely a subgenre, Chronicles of Narnia being the big one that people know from that subgenre, even if you don't read in that widely. Erotic fantasy is definitely a thing. I'm sure if you are an erotic fantasy reader, you don't need any recommendations from me because you're getting what you want. But yeah, that's not a genre that I read. And then both Captured in Words and Daniel Green mentioned military fantasy. I tend to think of military sci-fi as being like a popular subgenre in the sci-fi category, but I guess don't really know that much military fantasy. I'm sure there is a lot of it out there. The example that I could think of that I just read this year was The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. But basically military fantasy is exactly what it sounds like. It just like follows a soldier or a group of soldiers in a war type setting. Again, that almost seems like more of a trope than a subgenre, but we are here doing what we're doing, I guess. And then one that Bookborn mentioned was LitRPG or Progression Fantasy. I think those are slightly different, but basically like the characters have like stat blocks and they can level up, sometimes in a virtual setting, sometimes not. To me, that seems almost more sci-fi thing, because the examples that she gave were like Dungeon Crawler Carl and Ready Player One, which I think are both science fiction. But then she also mentioned for Progression Fantasy Cradle by Will White, and I've heard that is a fantasy that's somewhat inspired by like anime. But again, I don't really know enough to speak too in depth on those. So if you do have recommendations for actual fantasy, not sci-fi, that is lit RPG, I'd love to hear your recommendations down in the comments below. And then finally, my last category is new weird. And new weird is basically defined by breaking all genre expectations. It is speculative, but like whether you put it in fantasy or sci-fi or horror, it's just kind of like blurring all the lines. I read an interesting article that was like explaining basically like what new weird is, and the examples that it gave were Perdido Street Station by China Mieville, which apparently in its opening scene has like a sex scene where a character is like has a woman's body but a beetle's head. And then another example that was given was Born by Jeff Vandermeer, and in that one apparently the villain or the antagonist is like a flying bear, and the book doesn't really care whether you think that's believable or not. So new weird is just like, again, it's super out there, and whether you like it or not is definitely going to be dependent on, I think, the individual book, because they're all probably very, very different. So those are the 25 plus fantasy subgenres that I thought were at least somewhat relevant enough to talk about in this video. There are probably hundreds, and I'm just talking about the ones that I consider the most popular at the moment. But again, it'll be interesting to look back at this video in a few years and see if some of these have faded out of pop culture and if new ones have sprung up since then. Let me know down in the comments below what your favorite subgenre of fantasy is. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me as I rambled philosophically about fantasy subgenres. And as always, hi. You want to say hi? Boop, boop. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you again next time.